Good morning and welcome to the Japan Society's regular webinar on issues in world affairs and business that are relevant to both the UK and Japan. I am Bill Emmett and I have the honour and pleasure of chairing the Japan Society. Today, and I'm joining you unusually from London rather than my home in Dublin, we're looking at what has come to be called the West, a name that is a strange relic since one of its key members, Japan, is noticeably somewhat east. But this is no longer a geographical concept, more one that connotes the network of formal alliances and close relationships between the rich, advanced liberal democracies of the world. In recent decades, however, the West has been in decline. It lost global credibility through the unsuccessful wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but then most critically through the global financial crisis of 2008 and its long economic aftermath. That crisis made the Western countries look weak, it introduced new divides within and between them, and it helped to begin a drift away from open democracy and globalization among some other countries in the world. The most damaging result was the West's loss of its sense of unity and common purpose, a fragmentation and new fractiousness that then threatened to turn into disintegration under President Donald Trump, who at times behaved as if he considered Europe and Japan as being just as big a threat to his America First credo as the traditional rivals of China and Russia. And that combative attitude made it more difficult to achieve a cohesive approach by Western countries to those rivals, especially China, and to global challenges such as climate change and indeed COVID-19. But that was then, and now we have President Joe Biden. And we have witnessed both Joe Biden's bilateral summit with Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga in Washington in April, and his 8-day visit to Europe, chiefly for the G7 in Cornwall, and then the NATO summit in Brussels. The headline from those encounters was, quotes, "The West is back." And not only was the fractiousness absent, but also a number of joint initiatives have been announced on vaccines, on global infrastructure, and on climate. What do these amount to, however? What will they mean for the UK and for Japan? And critically, how do such efforts and the domestic condition of Western countries match up to the challenges before us, most notably the challenge of China? To address that question, we are joined, I hope, by two commentators, two interpreters of world affairs, who in Japan and the UK are leaders in their fields. From Tokyo, we're expecting to be joined by Hiroyuki Akita, foreign affairs and security commentator for Nikkei, whose most recent book was called Turbulence, a record of three kingdoms, security in the US, China, and Japan. And from London, we are already joined by Gideon Rachman, chief foreign affairs commentator for the Financial Times, a paper he joined in 2006, following a 15-year career at a publication you may have heard of, called The Economist. His latest book, a tad ominously for the West, was called Easternization, Asia's Rise and America's Decline, from Obama to Trump and Beyond. As usual, both our speakers will give opening remarks of 10 minutes, after which we will have a discussion and, crucially, your questions. Please submit them at any time using the Q&A function, and feel free to vote for other people's questions so as to bring them more rapidly to my attention. As President Biden's recent visit to Europe, my plan was always to start today with Gideon Rachman. Over to you, Gideon, and welcome to the Japan Society.
Thank you very much, Bill. Nice to be talking to you, and I hope in due course to Hiro, because I'll be interested to hear the Japanese viewpoint on all of this. No, as you said, the theme really of Biden's visit to Europe, and I think much of his foreign policy is the West is back. That's I think, crucial to his approach to the world. I think, like Donald Trump, in one respect, he does believe that the United States is now in a confrontation with China. But unlike Donald Trump, he believes that it's crucial to rally America's allies. So the G7 summit was the first one that he attended in person, and it was a summit of the West plus Japan. But before that, he'd done a virtual summit with the Quad, with India, Australia, and Japan. And I think he's trying to unite both those legs of the, if you like to call it, the democratic world, the Asian bit and the European bit. And I guess the G7 sort of straddles both. And interestingly, the guests to the G7 very much were a nod in that direction, more than a nod, a sort of kind of pulling them in. It was Australia, India, South Korea, and then South Africa added pretty much as a sort of late afterthought, because I think they thought we can't seem to exclude Africa. But really, it was about this anti-China front, I think, that they were attempting to form. And I think the resurgence of the importance of the G7 is really quite interesting. I mean, I remember you referred to the global financial crisis, covering the first G20 summits in Washington and then in London. And then there was one, I think, in Pittsburgh, 2010. And I remember the Pittsburgh one, people were saying, well, the G7 may never even meet again. You know, it's really not necessary anymore, because this is the, you know, the G20 is much more fit for the modern world because it covers all the emerging economies, a much larger share of the world economy. The G7 is now, as of 2021, I think down to only about 40% of the world economy, whereas it was 80% of the world economy when it was formed in the mid-70s. So if you're looking for sort of sheer spread, I see here, of economic might and power, then clearly the G20 is more appropriate. But what's happened in the intervening 10 years since people were saying, well, the G7's all washed up, is this increase in rivalry with China that makes the idea of sort of co-management of the world between Beijing and Washington seem just much less plausible. And therefore, the Americans and to some extent the Europeans are falling back on this old structure, which may no longer have the economic heft that it had, but it's still pretty powerful economically, and is looking to kind of reassert Western or G7 leadership of the world, realizing that this is an uphill task given the centrality of China to the global economy, but it feels an urgent one because they don't really feel that they can work closely with China, except on some issues where they're going to have to try. Obviously, climate is the one that is always cited, where you know it's pointless trying to do it without China. So that was really the backdrop to this G7 summit. It was an institution that's had been thought to be more or less obsolescent, which is now being revived. And as you said, they came up with a pretty ambitious agenda, a lot of it with the subtext of China. I mean, of course, the global, you know, the pandemic is a global issue, but there was this sense that they had to show that the countries assembled around the G7 table were capable of showing leadership. Similarly, on this almost kind of what you might call the Western alternative to Belt and Road was something they came up with. And again, on the whole question of climate, there was again an attempt to assert leadership. But my fear is that they were stronger on this rhetoric of the West is back than the reality. So that if you look at what happened on vaccines, you know, of course, Boris Johnson, who's a great booster, would make anything sound marvelous and you know, like a huge initiative, but actually they sort of struggle to come up with this headline figure of 1 million vaccines for the rest of the world over the next 18 months. And you compare that to what the WHO is saying we need, which is 11 million. That really is falling quite short. And that, you know, even leaving out China is, even in our own self-interest, obviously not a good way of addressing this challenge, because we see how quickly new variants are emerging in places like India, how quickly, you know, Africa is succumbing to further waves of coronavirus. So if we just want to control it in the West, it's going to be very difficult unless you can put more energy behind the vaccine drive. But there is also this rivalry with China element. The various, I think, 2 main Chinese vaccines are being donated at a great pace to the rest of the world. And China, and indeed the Russians to some extent, are trying to demonstrate their kind of greater generosity and efficacy on the vaccine drives. That said, it does look like the Chinese vaccine is less effective than the major Western vaccines. So it's not clear this kind of propaganda struggle is who's going to win in it. But there's also just a public health issue. And I don't think the G7 really met the challenge on vaccines. On Belt and Road, I think it's even further grounds for skepticism. There's talk of setting up this kind of G7 alternative, which will be more transparent, more environmentally friendly. But there is the question of where's the money? I mean, I think Trump was talking about something similar, and not really much happened. And meanwhile, Chinese lending, either directly to the Belt and Road Initiative or other sorts of associated initiatives. If in the old days when I was able to travel, you could see its evidence all over the world. I mean, just a couple of examples. They're building an entire new capital for Egypt, an alternative to Cairo. Chinese banks and construction companies. There was one of the recent Zoom calls I did was with the president of Colombia, who was a think tank thing with some Americans. And Duque is very pro-American, educated in the United States. And then somebody said, well, yeah, but what about the fact that the Chinese are building the metro in Bogota? Are you going to do something about it? Why are you doing that? And he said, look, they made the best offers. What am I going to do? It was the cheapest, best offer. Of course, we're going to take it. And I think that pattern is playing out all over the developing world. And the G7 is playing catch up very late and with not that much money. And then finally, well, climate, perhaps I'll save because I'm conscious I don't want to go too much over my 10 minutes. But I think just broadly on the underlying attitudes to China and even to Russia, there's some unity, but there are also some divisions. It was noticeable that I think both the US and indeed the Japanese attitude in the sort of what was the briefings in the corridors of the G7 was tougher on China than the Europeans, who are still a bit equivocal. Angela Merkel, who admittedly is going, but I think probably still represents the center of gravity of conservative thought in Germany, was until very recently trying to push through an EU-China investment deal. Macron has talked about the need for Europe to maintain its strategic independence in dealings with China. The Australians were complaining to me, and they're very close to the British at the moment, that Boris Johnson is still, as they put it, very cake and eat it on China. It hasn't really made the call on how he wants to deal with this. So there is a strong difference of emphasis there on China. And I think even their divisions on Russia. I mean, Biden went off afterwards to see Putin, hoping to present a united Western Front. And for that meeting, he might have done so. But you could see it even within Europe, actually. At the most recent EU summit, Merkel and Macron tried to railroad the rest of the EU into a summit with Putin, and they got pushed back. So even the EU can't come up with a unified attitude to Russia, let alone the US, the Chinese, and the Japanese, who of course have their own issues with the islands and so on, and the effort to have some sort of rapprochement there. So I think, I don't want to be too depressing about it all. I think it's quite impressive in some ways that, given how relatively rapidly it's happened over the last 18 months, there has been, I think, in what must be quite shocking ways to Beijing, a sort of rallying of the democratic world to push back against China, perhaps more than one would have imagined. But the scale of the task is huge. And there are, perhaps understandably, but there are differences in emphasis which will play out in differences in policy. And there's a question of resources, not to mention our own democratic stability in the United States and to a lesser extent in Europe. So there's been a shift in mood, but I don't think we're there yet. And I'll leave it there for now.
Splendid. Thank you very much, Gideon. And we'll come back very much to that question of what pushing back looks like, what the unity amounts to, where the disunity has happened, and in effect, where's the beef? Where is there going to be a sustained change, or is this a flash in the pan? I welcome from Tokyo, Hiroyuki Akita. We're delighted to see you, Hiro, and welcome to the Japan Society. Gideon has given us a fine introduction of the point of view from Western Europe, shall we say, and from the Financial Times. How about from the parent company, from Nikkei?
Hi, boss.
First of all, I'm really sorry. I miscalculated 1 hour. And I know that Japan is supposed to be a very, very punctual, but it is very loose-facing to be late for this webinar. So I apologize for being late, but I'm glad that I could, catch up. So I'd like to use my about less than 10 minutes to present my perspective from Tokyo. So basically, Japan welcome. Japan says, so I'd like to make 2 points. One is about the assessment of Biden foreign policy, which Gideon has already described from a London perspective, and G7 and NATO summit. So this is the first point. And secondly, I'd like to mention about the challenges we face in dealing with China. So first point, assessment of Biden foreign policy and G7 and NATO summit meeting. I think that Tokyo assesses that Biden so far effectively rebuilt the coalition and like-minded countries cooperation in order to focus more on China. So he invited Suga and ROK president for the first face-to-face meeting at White House, not because Biden loved Suga or Moon, but it is only because Japan and Korea are geographically located next to China and the most important allies to deal with China. And then he traveled to UK and attended the G7, and also in Europe attended the NATO summit meeting. And it seems to us that the US and Europe finally fixed its relation and stand at the same starting point about how to deal with basic starting point in dealing with China and more or less against Russia. But as Gideon described, I think this is just a starting point. That goes to a second point of mine. That is, if I use a metaphor of mountain climbing, if dealing with China is to climb very steep mountains, we have just agreed to climb together. But as for the logistics, or as for the concrete planning, and also about the budget, we haven't agreed at all. And in this respect, there are many, many challenges ahead. Concretely speaking, I think there are 3 different levels of the strategic competition vis-a-vis China. First is geopolitical competition, mainly on the maritime domain, like South China Sea and East China Sea. So how to push back China in this domain. And second is the competition over the high-tech hegemony, like 5G or digital infrastructure, and also other high-tech such as quantum and so on. And third is competition over the political system or over the democratic value. And for Japan, and depending on each country's, the priority are totally different, I think, because of the difference of geography and also difference of the policy priorities. So for Japan, most important competition is geopolitical competition, because Japan faces China's military expansion physically. For example, as you may know, China sends patrol vessels to sea territory of Senkaku routinely. And China's naval activity surrounding Japan is very, very active. So that is most important. And second most important is high-tech competition. But to be frank, competition over the value, or democratic value, or political system is important, but the least important for Japan, because if we emphasize on this issue, we cannot cooperate or alienate a potential partner such as Vietnam. Vietnam is not a democratic country at all. It's governed by Communist Party regime. But in order to win the competition over the geopolitics, we really need to cooperate with Vietnam or a country like Thailand and also Philippines, governed by very, very populist leaders. So that is Japan. But I assume that for Europe, geopolitical competition is important, but not the most important. Of course, UK's decision to send an aircraft carrier in the Pacific is highly, highly welcomed as a symbolic gesture. But we don't expect that Europe will engage this geopolitical competition as one of the first priority strategy. But we assume that for Europe, competition over the value or maybe norms or high-tech hegemony is more important. So that is Europe. And also other countries like India and ASEAN countries are also very important for us to push forward free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. India is now more willing to enhance its cooperation with Quad members, that is Japan, Australia, and US. But as India shares the land border, India is most cautious to accelerate military cooperation, security cooperation with US or rest of other countries. And so because India is vulnerable geographically vis-a-vis China, maybe even more vulnerable than Japan because they have a land border dispute that is going on right now. And as for ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, they are more complex, but it is very, very important for Europe and US and Japan to share the strategy with those countries because they expand, they cover the most important geographical area in the Pacific. But the ASEAN country is divided into, if I may impose the color to those countries, divided into three colors. One is a pink countries, such as neighboring country of China, such as Cambodia, or Laos, or Myanmar, because they don't have a choice rather than closely cooperate with China. And on the other hand, there is blue states that is ally of US, like Japan and Australia, and technically Philippines and Thailand. They are treaty allies. Then there is a purple or white countries try to maintain a neutrality, such as Indonesia, or maybe Malaysia in some degree. They don't want to take a side. Of course, no country wants to take a side, but the blue state is already taking a side because they are ally. We are ally of the US, but Indonesia makes much of the neutrality and in strategic autonomy. So having successful G7 summit meeting or NATO or US-Japan leaders meeting and so on have not solved any issue about how to consolidate or how to unite these countries or integrate these countries' strategy in some degree to better deal with China. So I didn't mention about Russia, but Gideon mentioned about Russia. So I think I used the 9 minutes, so I stop here.
Thank you very much, Hiroyuki. That was splendid, and I like all your colored states. I think we'll have
Sorry for being arrogant. I don't.
We'll have to
just to make it.
That also, thank you for the typology of the priority issues of geopolitical, maritime, high tech, and norms. I think it is that's very useful way to look at it. And perhaps I might start by going back to Gideon and asking you about that maritime question. I mean, since we've got the carrier strike force heading for Indo-Pacific, it's an Anglo-European carrier strike force with a Dutch warship, if I understand it correctly. It also follows a British interesting venture in the Black Sea with a warship recently, a sort of a new naval foreign policy. How do you, Gideon, think that this maritime domain fits in, which, as Hiroyuki said, is absolutely number one priority for Japan. Where does it fit in for us?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting initiative, one I've been following, and I think, as you say, it's not just Anglo-European. I think critically, it's also has a strong American component. There are American Marines on board that ship, as well as some American planes. And to be honest, that made me feel a lot better about it, because I was concerned that, if the Chinese wanted to make an example of somebody, much easier to take on the British, who are not a major naval force in the Pacific, than the Americans. Because obviously the risk of a confrontation with the Americans are that much higher, but the British are associated with the century of humiliation. We, I believe, began it with the Opium Wars and all of that, and their relations are bad over Hong Kong. Britain, now has a much smaller navy than China, and the ship will be a long way from home. So, I think potentially it's more hazardous for the UK to start sending, flexing its rather smaller muscles a long way from home. So I think it's probably not an accident that the Americans are so closely, actually on the ship. What do we think we're doing is a separate issue. It's debated in some. There's one theory is that it's almost an accident, that in the sense that when the defense allocations were done, the Navy won a sort of big argument, got these 2 aircraft carriers built. I think Britain, is unusual in actually having 2 amongst the mid-ranking powers. But then what do you do with them? And a lot of people think they're obsolete, they're big floating targets, etc. And they come on stream just as this Indo-Pacific tilt is taking place in everybody's foreign policy, but include the UK as well, partly associated with Brexit, partly associated with the rise of China. There is this rhetoric around norms and so on. And so it seems like a good way of combining a number of themes of the British foreign policy, the global Britain idea, the idea of Britain is, back and is looking not well beyond Europe, Britain as a upholder of the global rules-based order and all of that. And but nonetheless, I think there is a sort of incoherence in it. What exactly is the point we're trying to prove? I'm not sure that we're going to go to war in Asia if it ever comes to that. I don't think the British public, probably even aware of this mission, let alone signed up for that. There are the real hawks think that the British are dodging it a bit because they're not going to sail through the Taiwan Straits. They're not going to, and so some argue, I mean, I've had Taiwanese friends or friends based in Taiwan arguing that we're actually sending the wrong signal, sending a weak signal of weakness by not doing that. In the same way that the German Navy is going out to that region, but is then combining it with a port visit to Shanghai. So is it this friendly, not friendly? The China will treat this with a degree of contempt. But I think that it is interesting to hear Hiro say that it's very welcomed in Japan. I think broadly speaking, it's welcomed in Australia and in the region where people feel that every little bit helps. And the more that you send, so I've debated this internally. I'll shut up in a second. But in the end, I think it's a good idea because for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that the way that China wants to portray the struggle in the Pacific is that this is really just about American hegemony. It's got nothing to do with norms. It's about America unwilling to accept a rival superpower. And to the extent that other countries, Japan, Britain, India, whatever, get involved, it strengthens the argument, which I do believe, that no, this is about resisting a country that is authoritarian and that is increasingly inclined to break rules and to assert its power in ways we don't like. And this is not just the US v Beijing. I think that's an important message to send. And I think also it has a kind of potentially a help for the UK in its own security issues, in the sense that the threat to us is not, as Hiro was implying, it's not China. We're a long way away. It's more likely to be Russia. But if we want to keep the Americans interested in defending Europe, it probably helps that we help out in the Pacific, in the sense that there's a sort of quid pro quo going on there. So I think, although it's not uncomplicated, what Britain's decided to do, I think, broadly speaking, I can sort of think it's a good idea.
Thank you. And Hiroyuki, Nicholas McLean, our member, has asked whether one result of the G7 meeting, is it likely to drive China still closer to the other autocracies or to enemies of the West, which is sort of in a way the flip side of Gideon's point about that within the region, the British and German and French and other initiatives are ways of saying this isn't just a binary issue. What do you think about that? I mean, that brings back Russia into the question, into the frame, really. And it's 50 years since Henry Kissinger's and Richard Nixon's opening to China to then split China away from the Soviet Union. And now we've had Biden and Putin and this now failed initiative of Macron and Merkel to have a summit with Putin. Is Russia in play as far as the networks and relationships are concerned, or are they remorselessly on the Chinese side? And how much does it matter?
Okay, among Japanese strategists, in past maybe 7 or 8 years, especially during Abe administration, there are two different hypotheses competing each other, that compete each other. One hypothesis is that Russia never wants to be a junior partner of China, though its GDP is about 1/10 of China and population is 1/10, but still, so because of in imbalance or asymmetric, maybe Russia is afraid of being a junior partner. So if Japan reach out if Japan reach out and help Russia to reduce economic reliance and also geopolitical reliance on China, maybe Japan will not be able to drive wedge between Moscow and Beijing, but at least Japan can, slow down the Russia and China's axis. So that is one hypothesis. So that is the reason why Abe tried to maintain close contact with Putin as frequently as possible. So, but this failed. This didn't happen. So second hypothesis was correct. That is, China is too huge for Moscow. So whatever Japan or Western country could do to Russia to reduce the reliance on China, it is too late. And also US, Moscow's worsening relationship will, of course, push Russia to the Chinese side even further. So there is very, very remote hope, whatever we do to Moscow, remote hope that we can, split or at least slow down the pace of axis of Beijing and Moscow. So going back to your question, I think that whatever outcomes G7, whatever outcomes G7 generated, Moscow, seems to us, Moscow is determined to cooperate even more closely with Beijing, though it is very, very uncomfortable strategically, because Beijing can provide market, and also Beijing is willing to fight political battle against US together with Moscow. So G7 or Western countries' policy to Moscow, of course, affect their Putin's calculus in some degree, but it is very limited. That is my impression.
And thank you. And let me ask a follow-up question of my own, really, about China and other autocracies or other countries and their relationship, which is a question about vaccines and the significance or otherwise of vaccines. China is now producing half of the world's vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines, far and away the biggest producer of vaccines, Sinovac and Sinopharm, and we see them being used extensively in Indonesia and now even in Vietnam. But they are inferior vaccines compared with the Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca vaccines, at least. How is that seen from Japan? Is that an important, like, geopolitical diplomatic card and dependency, as you described it, that China is developing, and indeed a new set of norms about how you go about building building new drugs and so forth without clinical trials and China's own system? Or is it continued proof of China's backwardness on technology?
I think there are two elements. One element is that the vaccine itself is very vaccine assistance by China are being welcomed by many other Asian countries like Indonesia and also Philippines and so on, just because they need a vaccine. Whatever quality they are, they really desperately need it. So in that sense, China's vaccine diplomacy is have some effectiveness. But more importantly, there is second negative element. That is, though no country openly say it, but we all know that this infection of COVID-19 initially spread from China. Of course, origin of the virus is maybe there is argument about what is the origin of virus, regardless of whatever origin it is from. But it is true that the Chinese government couldn't prevent them from spreading. So, and also that is due to the maybe initial cover-up by not central government, but the maybe Wuhan government or some authority. So if I think many ASEAN democratic countries especially think this way, I think if China allowed freedom of speech or freedom of media, maybe there won't any cover-up because it will be reported as quickly as it were to be in UK or Japan. So this infection didn't spread. So first element, vaccine diplomacy, that is positive for China. But second element, that is negative for China. Question is, how does it offset each other? And I'm afraid, but I think that it is a very huge minus. So in sum, China tries to recover its reputation by vaccine diplomacy. That is good. I don't think it's bad things to do, but that there is a limitation that they can make up.
Thank you. No, that's very, very interesting. Gideon, one of our members, Simon Shelton, who actually has had a long career in the defense industry, has asked a question saying, while all leaders stress there is no emerging Cold War with China, do the speakers think that increases in overall defense and security spending by G7 countries and their partners to meet China's challenges are either necessary or indeed inevitable? Are we now in a new arms race, is really what the question. Is there going to be an escalation of defense and security spending in all domains? And is that an important driver of Western policy, do you think, Gideon?
Look, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the new Cold War analogy than a lot of people. I mean, obviously there are differences, the most important being the intertwining of the two economies of the PRC and the US in a way that the USSR and the US never were, and that there are many others that one could point to. But I do think that the parallels are also quite striking. Two superpowers, an ideological element to it, increasingly a struggle for global influence, waged by a number of different means. Some of them sort of trials of military strength, but a lot of it financial, economic, propaganda. And, you know, we're in the foothills of a Cold War, but you're beginning to get demands by both Beijing and Washington to sort of pick a side. And now, of course, even in the Cold War, you had the non-aligned movement, but generally countries are coming under pressure. It happened to the UK over Huawei, where we thought, well, we could play both sides. We could adopt the Chinese 5G, be all right. And then the Americans really essentially twisted our arm not to do that. And we've now, I think, sort of retrospectively just sort of taken ownership of that decision and said, well, you know, we're pleased we did it anyway, but there's no disguising the pressure on us. To come to the arms race, though, look, I think there will be an element of extra arms spending, but I think that, as I sort of implied in my answer on the aircraft carrier, I think a lot of the sort of conventional weaponry that you would have seen people pouring money into in the first Cold War, it's not by no means irrelevant, otherwise China wouldn't be pouring money into its navy, but it's not the only thing now. That a lot of the challenges that people are looking at are technological, and also vulnerabilities of our systems to cyber assault is, I think, a major issue. So I would imagine, as much as the traditional US pressure on its allies to spend more on defense, initially focused mainly on Russia, will continue, that a lot of the more innovative and important stuff maybe will go around trying to develop Western, broadly defined, technological alternatives to reduce technological dependence on China, and also to try to develop rules of the road on cyber attacks, which interestingly were a major theme of the Russia-US summit, where Biden actually handed Putin a list of key infrastructural targets that Russia must under no circumstances attack. Arguably, you know, a bit of a sort of bold move there. He might have sort of put them in his back pocket and said thanks for the list, but you know, the Russians would know them as well. And obviously, the Americans are increasingly concerned. You know, cyber attacks, some of them by criminal gangs, and in fact, I think one of the points Biden made was that these aren't necessarily coming from the Russian state, but they are coming from Russian soil with Russian connivance. You know, they're tolerating criminal gangs. But this whole idea of cyber resilience to avoid putting us in a position where we could be vulnerable to these attacks, I think is actually possibly going to be even more of a focus than simply putting money into weaponry.
Thank you. So just to change the theme a little bit, Habib Badawi from Lebanese University has put in a question asking really about infrastructure. As Habib Badawi says, most ASEAN countries do not wish to take sides between US, Japan, and China, which really both of you made that point. A major trade partner and aid provider in Southeast Asia, while Japan has activated its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. In your opinion, can that strategy, can the West as well counter effectively the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of infrastructure? I mean, you, Gideon, said, well, it remains to be seen. We don't know what the numbers are. And you, Hiro, said, you know, we've agreed to climb together, but we haven't got the budget or the logistics sorted out. And I think that's fair. Is there political will, do you think, first Gideon and back then to you, Hiro, to really put this money into international public investment?
My guess is no. I mean, if you look at the infrastructural challenges that Biden faces in the United States alone and the difficulty in getting an infrastructure package through Congress for the United States, it's tricky. And, you know, it's also harder to direct private sector lenders to do this at the state's behest, which might be another way of doing it. Whereas the sort of, I think, the nexus between state and banks in China is much easier to organize a kind of national drive to invest. And also China was sitting on a lot of capital, and also a lot of construction firms which had built so many, how many motorways can you and high-rise blocks can you build in China? There was this sort of drive to now go and do this overseas. So there was a sort of logic there. I mean, I think that some of the West's rhetoric about debt trap diplomacy and the risks of borrowing too much from China and therefore getting sucked in and making yourself vulnerable. I don't think it's those warnings have been completely brushed away. We've seen a few evidences of the problems. Sri Lanka was a famous one that can cause. But until the West can sort of come up with a viable alternative, I think we're going to be struggling to catch up with China. I don't know whether, I mean, Hiro might have a better sense of it sitting, in Japan, and also the close connections between the Japanese and the Asian Development Bank, and Japan has been a big investor and lender. So maybe over to you.
Hiro?
Thank you very much. I echo Gideon's observation that there's a limitation that we could do. And also, I think that we should not, and also we don't have to compete against China in every infrastructure project, because there is a serious shortage of money for the infrastructure building. So what Japan and maybe US are trying to do is to prioritizing. For example, if my body is a whole infrastructure, there is infrastructure like a finger, or arms, or legs. Legs and fingers are important, but less important than nerve. So railway or bridge and road, whoever built, we can use it. So it's kind of like a finger or arms. So we can allow, we can just let China to build as long as it is open. Or Japan is even willing to cooperate with China under some condition like a transparency and debt, not excessive debt and so on. But as for digital infrastructure, like 5G or digital platform, it is very, very crucial that infrastructure, it is kind of equivalent to nerve of human body. So we really need to compete against China. But at present, we have to be very, very pessimistic about the future. As far as I know, all ASEAN countries except Vietnam made a decision to introduce Huawei or ZTE for their 5G infrastructure project because it is cheap. And Ericsson and Nokia are very, very expensive. And secondly, country like, especially Muslim countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, maybe they do rather not to want to rely on a Western company. And they prefer, maybe they might prefer China because, 20 years of war, US war in Afghanistan and Iraq, Middle East, caused kind of like skepticism about the US foreign policy in Islam world, even in Asia. So they worry that if they rely on Western digital platform, maybe those information will be sucked by US, and then US will force or pressure those countries to, detain some suspects of terrorists and bring them to US and so on. So China, as for China, as long as they don't, China, they need to worry less about such interference. So that kind of a political handicap also exists. So I tend to be very pessimistic, but it is very important to push back in the digital infrastructure from now. And also undersea cable is also very important.
One, perhaps as a supplementary issue to this area, not so much technology, but coming up, probably there will be an issue about poor country debt, or poor and middle income country debt. In the early 1990s, when there was the third world debt crisis or Latin American debt crisis, the Brady Plan from America was essentially financed by a Japanese guarantee. Now we see China as having been the biggest lender to most countries, often through the Belt and Road, and as has been said about debt dependency issues. But sort of the organizations for dealing with debt, like the Paris Club, are essentially Western run organizations that China's not part of. What will Japan's attitude be to this area? Are you able to step up as guarantor now that your own debt is now 240% of GDP? Or...
Japanese public debt is 256% of GDP, accumulated public debt. And Japan tax annual revenue is just 40% of total budget. So Japan have to rely on 6% of budget on government bond. So very, very sadly, it is very, very unrealistic for, as of today, for Japan to play that role. But alternatively, what the Japanese government is trying to do is to cooperate with AIIB through the ADB so by cooperating each other with China's AIIB, maybe Japan tries to avoid debt trap, kind of a debt trap problem, and also make a loan to be more debt sustainable, and so on. So that is try to reform from within rather than try to compete in that domain.
Thank you. And Gideon, the risk of being over military oriented, I'm going to put a question that Anthony Capobianco has put in, because Taiwan is, of course, one of the huge issues here, both for UK and Japan, or for the West and Japan. He has written, if President Xi sees a risk of an effective anti-China consensus forming, could he use the current window to forcibly reintegrate Taiwan now? If China attacks, how will they avoid damaging the chip manufacturing facilities in Taiwan? How do you see the Taiwan situation currently from your UK?
Gosh, look, I mean, it's intriguing. It's also been around a long, long time, Bill. I was thinking back to a time when I did a cover for The Economist when you were editing. I think it was rather controversially called Containing China in 1996. And it was over that Taiwan Straits crisis back then.
Yeah. I think I was called into the Chinese embassy for a lecture about that one.
Yeah, well, there you go. How right we were, though, in retrospect. Yeah, so, but what's happened since then, of course, is that in the intervening 25 years, it's actually become feasible for China to attack. And I think the American Navy or military planners are concerned about whether Chinese missile capabilities could keep the US Navy at distance and allow them to successfully invade Taiwan. And I think, was it Admiral Phil Davidson testifying before Congress said they could do it within 5 to 6 years a few months back. That said, first of all, not everybody's convinced of that. It's still a formidable undertaking. I mean, if you think, obviously military technology has changed since D-Day, but it's 3 times as or more the distance they would have to cross, naval landings, it's a very kind of retro thing they'd have to do, physically land on beaches, storm up and so on. And, is China really prepared to take that risk with, if you think of it in one way, Xi would love this to be his capstone achievement to rival, Mao and Deng. He would, if he was the guy who finally reunified the country, I think that would be a great achievement that he would want to sort of permanently put himself in the pantheon of the PRC's greatest leaders. But the risks are enormous. What if it went all horribly wrong? they can't be sure that they would win a quick and easy victory. There's the threat of American intervention, obviously. There's also, what if they ended up in a long partisan war within Taiwan? It's not straightforward. So I tend to think that they're rational enough not to do it. But unless, as they see it, the Taiwanese force their hand by declaring independence, which I don't think the Taiwanese will do, not formally. So I think we might still be in for a long period of stalemate, but that will be punctuated, however, by increasing Chinese pressure. You'll have more incursions around the islands by planes, ships. You may get, and this would be a major escalation, a seizure of some of the outlying Taiwanese islands, Pratas Islands, which are not, don't have people on them, and the Chinese could take relatively easily. That would be a big uptick in pressure. I mean, I think that, and it's something the Japanese, I'm sure, are also thinking about, that we should be thinking about this not so much in terms of the threat of invasion, although that's clearly something you have to think about and plan for, but also how do we bolster the Taiwanese system? Because I think that particularly now Hong Kong has gone, Taiwan becomes an incredibly important symbol of a different way for an ethnically Chinese nation to run politics. Sort of a rebuke to the argument you hear that there's something about China and Confucianism, et cetera, that means that Western style democracy would not work in a ethnically Chinese nation. Now, Taiwan shows that that's obviously not true. It's a vibrant democracy. And I think it's all the more important, therefore, that we find ways of supporting it, expanding Taiwan's international space. That's a tricky thing to do because it's provocative to China, but I think it's something we need to do. I think Japan is also thinking in that direction.
I've always thought that it's rather strange to dismiss democracy as being too Western, when you come from a country that is nominally Marxist, buried in Highgate. But there we are. Hiro, there's a question here from Stephen Gomersall, a former British ambassador to Japan. What should Europe and Japan do to avoid being entirely dependent on the US for deterrence vis-a-vis China and Russia? This is really a question that gets to the heart of whether we want the West to be too cohesive. How do you see that from Japan? Do you want to be not too dependent on the US?
Militarily, to be honest, militarily, it is very, very difficult. There's a limitation, especially for Japan. Japan heavily rely on a nuclear security umbrella provided by US and so on. But economically, I think that the US, EU and Europe and Japan, or UK and Japan, are doing and making a lot of effort, positive and effective effort to reduce reliance on the US. Japan initiated TPP without Trump administration, and now UK is joining a negotiation. And I don't think there is a high hurdle for UK to participate TPP. And also Japan and EU signed FTA trade agreement already. So that is one thing. And also in terms of norms sharing, in terms of defending international norms in the maritime domain, maybe EU or UK and Japan can cooperate more on pushing forward diplomacy to mobilize support to international law, especially UNCLOS. UNCLOS, US is not the member of, signing member of UNCLOS, but most of the European countries and Japan. So militarily, it is not so easy, but the rest of other domain, there are many things that we could do, and we are doing.
So I'm going to close with, we're running out of time, and I'm going to close just for a perfect symmetry of former ambassadors. I'm going to put a question to Gideon from former Ambassador Koji Tsuruoka, friend of the Japan Society, who asks you really, Gideon, will the UK have any concrete response on the end of democracy in Hong Kong? What happens in Hong Kong on the international front may be closely watched by Beijing as a precedent. A series of fait accompli are supporting evidence for China doing well. Hong Kong, briefly, as your last word.
Hello, Ambassador. Nice to hear from you. Look, I don't think there's much more to come. I think that the concrete response was the offer of visas to the holders of British Hong Kong passports and the ability to come and live and work in Britain. And potentially that is many, many people, hundreds of thousands, actually could even be millions, although I don't think anyone really expects it to get up that high. But it's a substantial gesture, particularly at a time when immigration has been very contentious in the UK. But I think that in terms of political confrontation, less so. I think the Chinese see that as a confrontational move, and one of the reasons that there's been a deterioration in UK-Chinese relations has been statements that Britain has made about Hong Kong, and perhaps particularly the repeated accusations that China has violated the joint declaration. The Chinese don't like that much, but they can easily brush it off. I think the thing to watch next, though, is what happens with the remaining commercial ties, which are very, lucrative for the UK with Hong Kong. The banks, the stockbrokers, etc., even the legal profession, British judges, British lawyers, British judges go and sit in Hong Kong courts. British lawyers make a lot of money, dealing with Hong Kong contracts or arguing in Hong Kong courts. And there was an interesting example where the Chinese government actually engaged a British QC to lead, or the Hong Kong government to lead the prosecution of some of the pro-democracy demonstrators, including Martin Lee and others. And he eventually came under such sustained political pressure in the UK that this guy dropped out. David Perry, his name was. And I think the foreign secretary eventually intervened. But that was just an isolated instance. I think the next thing to watch is, will British judges continue to sit in Hong Kong courts? This is, part of British influence. It's, as I say, there's money involved. I think it's going to become untenable over the, medium term. And then what happens to the British banks? HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, but it's one of the big four in the UK, is really under pressure from all directions on this. Gives every sign, though, I think, of prioritizing the Chinese market if it can, although its business is complicated by the fact that they're implicated in the Huawei case because Meng Wanzhou, when she was arrested, it was partly on the leak of business dealings she'd had with HSBC. But so I think that there will be British companies that are very dependent on Hong Kong that are going to actually, if anything, increase their dependence because it's so central to their business. Others may find themselves being forced either by British legislation or by Chinese retaliation slowly out of that Hong Kong market. I don't see why China would particularly want UK firms to maintain their historic position in China. And final thought, though, is these are very politically adept firms. I remember talking to the people behind Jardine Matheson, after all, their name goes all the way back to the Opium War, and saying, are you not finding it a little difficult with this new Chinese emphasis on patriotism and, the center of humiliation to do business with China? And they said, oh, it never comes up. They're fine about it. So these companies are quite good at maintaining their links with China, and they'll try to keep doing that. But I think it will become increasingly difficult for a variety of reasons, some of it coming from London, some of it coming from China.
Well, a big thank you to both Gideon Rachman and to Hiroyuki Akita for a fascinating discussion. Many themes we will certainly have to return to in coming months and years. Thank you also to all of the audience for an excellent lot of questions. I didn't manage to get to questions about cyber, about norms in international organizations, about space, about supply chain issues. and many others, but we got across a very wide range of interesting and important issues. And I invite Japan Society members to come again to a conversation that we're having next week with actually Gideon's colleague, Philip Stevens, and with Richard Needham. Sir Richard Needham, one of the founders of the UK-Japan 21st Century Group and a pioneer in selling Britain around the world in trade terms, really, in the 1980s and 1990s, a conversation about their view of as global Britain and Britain's place in the world and where Japan fits in. So a repeated thank you to Gideon Rachman and Hiroyuki Akita.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.